Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Society for Conservation Biology's Webinar Wednesday, which is scheduled once a month at this point. We're really excited this month to be introducing you to Dr. Michael Mascia. He is the Senior Vice President at Conservation International, and he heads up their Betty and Gordon Moore Center for Science. He really focuses on their research, technical assistance, and capacity building efforts. So we're happy to have him on board. His title is The Uncertain Future of Protected Lands and Waters. And a couple of other things about Mike just before we get started is he is also the Society's president at this point, board president, and he is the first social scientist who has served in this capacity with the Society. So I didn't introduce myself. I'm Deborah Luke. I'm the executive director here at the Society. So I know I and the rest of the board and other members of the Society are really excited to have somebody who is focusing in perhaps a slightly different area of conservation than some of us are. So to get us started, Mike, we're going to turn it over to you and you're going to control the slides. A couple of little housekeeping details for everybody on this call. You have been muted as you come on. But we will be doing question and answers at the end. So please write your questions down as you think of them or as the presentation goes on into the chat box. And then we will be looking at those questions at the very end and ask Mike those questions and he'll answer him at that point. But because we're going to have so many people on this webinar, you are muted during the webinar. It will be recorded and it will be posted with the rest of our webinars afterwards. So you'll be able to go back and look at it or share it with others, just like you can our previous webinars. So Mike, are you ready to go?
All set.
Excellent. Thank you. We're excited.
All right, me too.
Good.
So good afternoon, everyone, or morning or evening, wherever you are. As conservation scientists and decision makers, we're accustomed to seeing maps that look a lot like this, protected areas all around the world, and graphs that look a lot like this with protected areas and conservation lands and waters in ever increasing numbers and extent all around the world. But as we read the news, we often hear stories like this of legal changes to protected areas, national parks and otherwise that scale back protections either by allowing new human activities within those areas or making the boundaries of the areas smaller, or wiping them off the map entirely. And so that raises the question that I want to talk about with all of you today, which is the future of protected lands and waters. And this work that I'll share is a collection of work by not only myself and my team, but a broader community of people who are increasingly starting to look at these underlying dynamics of protected areas and assessing their long-term viability. As we all know, a protected area is a space that's set aside to conserve nature and biodiversity in perpetuity. But what we increasingly find are situations of downgrades, these sort of decreases in legal restrictions on human activities within a protected area, downsizes, a decrease in the size of these protected areas through legal change, and full degazettement, the loss of legal status for an entire area under government administration. And so what my team and others have been doing is trying to get a better understanding of these legal changes. We are not thinking about the effectiveness of management within these areas. We're not looking or tracking illegal activities within these areas. Those are separate and very legitimate things to look at. And fortunately, there are other teams that are looking at them carefully. And we're not tracking expansions or extensions of protected areas either, because again, there are established systems to look at those. Instead, what we're doing is trying to understand these legal changes that make protected area protections disappear, whether it's to eliminate protected areas or shrink them, or to roll back those protections that on established areas. And collectively, we refer to this as protected area downgrading, downsizing, or degazettement, otherwise known as PAD with 3 Ds. The scope of our work is global. And we begin our efforts to track this phenomenon, starting with the birth of the modern conservation movement or the protected area movement with Yellowstone, establishment of Yellowstone National Park in the 1870s. We've developed over the past decade a series of standardized definitions and decision trees and database structures, and use a variety of methods to generate the data that I'll share with you today, including desk research, focused trainings with in-country partners, archival research and mapping, and crowdsourcing, drawing on of both primary documents like government legal records, and then also secondary sources like the newspaper headlines that I was sharing with you earlier. To date, we have identified more than 3,700 instances of PAD that have been enacted legally. You can see the distribution here. The majority of them are downgrades, 700 downsizes, 350 or so degazettements, affecting more than 3,000 protected areas globally. This work is most recently published in a paper a couple of weeks ago in Science, led by Rachel Golden-Kroner here at Conservation International and also at George Mason University, and a broad team of people in the US and across Amazonia and around the world. If you take a look at that most recent summary work, you can see the distribution of the PAD events that we've identified and the total area affected. So nearly 2 million square kilometers across those 3,700 PAD events, totaling an area that is about equivalent to the size of Mexico. The dark gray on this map reflects those places where we've had the opportunity to do systematic archival data collection. And because of that, it's a bit of a heat map for places where we've identified PAD. In fact, we suspect that PAD is far more prevalent in places that we haven't yet identified. Recent research from another team that isn't reflected on this map out of China, I believe, identified about 400 instances of PAD, similar work in Bhutan, and preliminary conversations we're having with colleagues in Russia and elsewhere, again, indicate widespread PAD that is not reflected on this map. So I think one key message is that PAD is on the surface. If we look at the reasons or the proximate causes of PAD, about a little more than 60% we've been able to link directly to industrial scale resource extraction and development. Oil and gas, mining, infrastructure, forestry, fisheries, and the like. Another about a quarter is related to local land use and land claims. And interestingly for us as conservation scientists and practitioners, only about 1.7% has been carried out explicitly with the purpose of in strengthening conservation networks or protected area networks through some form of conservation planning. There are a variety of cases in which we see multiple causes at play, and certainly there's some instances where people may be saying one thing and actually the underlying cause is something else. But I think this gives us a rough sense of what's going on. Again, in blue, you see the industrial scale activities. In red, you see the local land pressures and land claims. Gray is other and multiple causes. And then obviously there are a suite of PAD events for which we aren't quite sure why they occurred. If you take a look at these events over time, you can see that a large percentage of them have occurred in this century. Focus on this decade, about two-thirds of all to identify have occurred since 2010. Looking at the slice of the pie, and associated with the different PAD events that we observe. Infrastructure leaps out among industrial causes as one major driver of PAD, and then subsistence access to protected lands and waters is another. Clearly, these are very different in their impacts on the environment, but for our purposes, just initially in terms of trying to categorize the phenomenon and understand it, we can see just sort of the distribution among these various proximate causes. And again, conservation planning, this sort of narrow sliver in, I guess, a medium gray at the bottom, sort of very modest in proportion given relative to all of these other sort of key drivers or proximate causes of PAD. If we take a look at proposed PAD events, we've been able to thus far identify almost 900 events. What's interesting is that most of these are now dormant, and only about 50 remain currently pending or active, with the potential to affect about a little more than 30,000 square kilometers globally. We use a formal structure for identifying these proposed PAD events of taking a very careful look at that they have to be formally introduced in legislation or as an executive order or something to that effect. And then they're sort of we sort of track the status of those proposals. It's a little bit murkier to keep an eye on than the enacted events themselves. And so we suspect, again, that there's a lot more PAD that has been proposed that we haven't yet been able to document or identify. And in looking at the distribution of PAD events globally, your eye will certainly be drawn immediately to the United States, and the sort of hot pink around the border. Some of you may recall there have been repeated efforts in the United States Congress to allow infrastructure development within national parks and other protected areas along the U.S. border, both first the entirety of the United States border, and then subsequently just on the southern border with Mexico and the northern border with Canada, with the intent of securing the border against possible terrorism or for national security purposes. And then other places, again, you can see a suite or a sort of smattering of proposed PAD events, most of which are sort of dormant, some of which are still pending. And if you zoom in on a region like the Amazon, you can see here in yellow and in pink the enacted and the proposed PAD events, and they often cluster. They can represent significant areas, and so what we are finding here are from a conservation standpoint are that this is a meaningful phenomenon. It's a significant phenomenon that we're observing. In terms of the national conservation estate, we're looking at some countries where no PAD has been observed. Other countries, up to 85% of the protected areas in the country have been affected by downgrading, downsizing, or degazettement, some combination of the three. And additionally, rates of PAD are starting to match the rates of establishment of protected areas, where we see the curve in some contexts starting to flatten out, and sort of don't see new protected areas coming online or not as rapidly as before. At the same time, that's sort of corresponding to the increased rate or the seemingly increased rate of legal rollbacks to those protected areas. And so after perhaps a long period of net growth, we may be looking at a plateauing or even a negative trend, which is a challenging situation from a policy standpoint, as we increasingly hear calls to scale up protection of lands and waters to safeguard biodiversity and ensure a stable climate for humanity in the coming decades. In about 5% of the cases that we have studied, we've seen offsets, either spatial offsets or regulatory offsets. Basically, when a PAD event occurs of a protected area, or tightening restrictions in a different part of a protected area, that are and is an attempt to sort of offset the legal change that has been associated. Here you can see with Yasuni in Ecuador, the original protected area in 1979, the sort of in the upper right-hand corner, a significant portion of that was downsized out of the park in 1990, and yet subsequently the significantly shifted. There are, as with any kind of offsetting programs, some interesting questions raised about the equivalence of the areas that are added relative to those that were downsized or degazetted or downgraded at the same time. And interestingly, we see that about a quarter of PAD events have been reversed. So legal changes have gone through, areas have been excised from the park, or parks have been protected areas have been eliminated, or the regulations have been made more permissive, and then subsequently, in about a quarter of those cases, the original protections were restored. And so an interesting area, I think, for further research is to understand those contexts in which PAD was reversed and those that it wasn't, and what the ecological and social implications are of those reversals. And then a large percentage of the cases that we observed were like those in the US borders, where a single legal decision had systemic consequences for protected areas. And this is, I would say, particularly true for downgrades, where a single action, either by the executive branch, judicial branch, or legislative branch of government, can have far-reaching effects. And we've seen this in the United States with the rules governing development of infrastructure within the borderlands and border protected areas, and a similar dynamic within India, opening up protected areas across the country for subsistence use of bamboo. Let's start to take a closer look at it. Certain protected areas do seem to be at greater risk of PAD. Some of that relates to the physical characteristics of the protected area and its location. So some work that Will Symes and others worked on several years ago indicated that larger protected areas, particularly those that were closer to areas of higher population density, were at greater risk of downsizing and PAD as a whole. And then subsequent work that our team did in Rondônia, Brazil, indicated that protected area performance was also a key predictor of outcomes, and that those protected areas with the highest rate of deforestation were at greater risk of PAD. And what the work seemed to suggest was that those areas were being bargained away as part of a more complex negotiation between conservation interests and development interests and government actors over time. And so, what does all of this mean? Well, at one, based on one very crude measure, the ability to reach area targets established under the Convention on Biological Diversity, we can see that downsizing and degazettement of protected areas, by definition, affects the area covered by those protected lands and waters, and in certain cases, it has reduced the conservation estate or the potential conservation estate sufficiently that protected countries have not or would not meet their obligations under the CBD as a result. And here in an analysis from 2014, we identified 4 countries that for whom that was the case. We need to take another look at that for the work that we most recently did in Amazonia, but it's an interesting question more generally in terms of people being, or countries being able to hit their international obligations and the targets established within them. In terms of actual impacts on the ecology or the biophysical world, work that Jessica Forrest led, looking at the consequences of PAD in Peru and in peninsular Malaysia, demonstrated that rates of tropical deforestation and carbon emissions were significantly higher in areas that were than those that remained within the conservation estate. There remains really work that we've done looking at PAD on Yosemite National Park, one of the iconic and first national parks in the United States. And removed from protection, that they were more augmented forests than those that were protected. And interestingly, those areas that were downsized and subsequently reprotected are augmented, remained unprotected. So this idea of protection matters, and that restoring protection can have significant impacts, suggests some interesting policy implications and responses to PAD. And then it's important to note that PAD affects iconic protected areas, not only Yosemite, but around the world. And a number of World Heritage sites have been padded over the years. I'll just mention a couple of them here. Congo has been downgraded to allow for oil exploration. In Oman, the Arabian Oryx Sanctuary, another World Heritage Site, was dramatically downsized, again, in relation to oil and gas development. So what does all of this mean? Well, I mean, the top line message in all of this is that how we govern these lands and waters will shape the ecology and the land use and land cover of these places, and at the same time, the performance of these places, their biophysical status and change, can influence how we govern them. So as we saw with in Rondonia, poorly performing protected areas, those with high deforestation rates, could actually affect the people's choices about whether or not to protect in the first place. So understanding those complex dynamics, those reciprocal dynamics, is an important thing for our science. Secondly, it's important that we think about the dynamics of protected areas when we are analyzing the performance and impacts of those conservation interventions and any others. If we only look at those protected areas that remain on the map when we think about their efficacy, we're using a biased sample. rather than looking at all of the protected areas that have ever existed and tracking the consequences or the outcomes for forests. And so we need to sort of think about that broader context as we think about how we measure the performance of this strategy and any other. And then, more generally, there's a need for more research in this space and a broader community of scholars focusing on it. Right now, it's a very small group of individuals who have expertise in documenting PAD, analyzing the data, and making sense of it. And we're only just scratching the surface in terms of our understanding of the extent of PAD, the spatial and temporal patterns and trends that we observe, the factors that influence the likelihood of PAD and its implications for both people and nature, and whether or to what extent PAD is unique to state-designated and state-managed protected areas, which have been the focus of our work, or whether this same challenge of impermanence also extends to other conservation interventions, indigenous lands, CBNRM regimes, payments for ecosystem services, eco-certification, and the list can go on and on. And then from a policy perspective, the fundamental point is that protected areas are not necessarily permanent, and that our work to sustain these areas for both nature and the people depend upon it doesn't end when they are legally established, but in fact the work is just beginning, and that these protected areas, which we have sort of placed so much responsibility upon, are in fact they require that stewardship over the longer term, and that these legal changes, while in some cases they may advance conservation ends or restore or address historic injustices, in a large number of cases in a lot of places that we care about, are actually undermining the conservation objectives that these areas were established for in the first place. And so there's certainly a need for some thoughtful and evidence-based policy responses, while at the same time building out the science. Some obvious areas to focus on are first just documentation to enhance transparency and accountability. So better monitoring and tracking and reporting of PAD, whether under the Convention on Biological Diversity or in national systems and archives, national protected area tracking and things like that, conservation measurement. Second, it's important to think about the processes governing PAD. We have, in many places, very complicated and evidence-based processes for establishing protected areas in the first place, requiring participation, transparency, science, etc. But there's no parallel set of policies governing legal changes to these areas. And my guess is that this is just a bit of a blind spot in the efforts to establish protected area legislation, but we would argue that the policies governing PAD should mirror those governing protected areas establishment. Thirdly, it's interesting to think about the mitigation hierarchy as a lens or a framework for thinking about PAD, where avoidance is the first step, and offset a suite of activities that we think about in terms of the policy options at bay, or at play rather, when we are thinking about how to areas in their future. And then lastly, we are making investments in land use practices that can jeopardize the future of protected areas, or think about the firms themselves that are making land use change. We can think about safeguard policies that are to ensure that money isn't flowing into existing activities, aren't occurring within existing protected areas, but potentially also in previously protected areas. Because the loophole and all, it's possible to do something completely legal what used to be a protected area if somebody is only going on the status quo of today as their reference point or their baseline. For those of you who are interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to me. I also encourage you to go to padtracker.org, which is our website where for all things pad. You can download data and from all of our work here, play around with it for yourself. There's an interactive map that you can explore to make sense of individual events. All of our publications are listed here. We have 10, I think, at this point over in our work, with more on the way. And more generally, would welcome thoughts or suggestions for leads on additional data as we try to build out a much more comprehensive global understanding of what's going on, not just in the 13 countries where we've done the in-depth archival work, not just in the 70-something countries where we've been able to piece together other work through desktop and crowdsourcing, but the full sort of 200 or so governing the lands and waters of planet Earth. And with that, I'll just again acknowledge the donors and the extensive team that has contributed to this work. These are just the co-authors whose work is reflected here. There's also a much longer list of people who have contributed data and helped us ground truth it and resource this effort. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you.
That's very informative and provoking, thought-provoking. We do have quite a few questions that have been submitted. So for those of you that are listening, if you have other questions, please write them in the chat box. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now, our Marketing and Communications Manager here at SCB, and she's going to go through the questions with you, and you can have at answering them.
Great, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And yes, please submit more questions in the chat box. We do have about 30 minutes left for questions, so we have a lot of time. So don't be shy about submitting questions. But here's a first one. Is the word encroachment an appropriate way to describe PAD?
Is encroachment an appropriate way to describe that?
Yes, the word encroachment. Is that appropriate? And he's gone. Apologies, everyone. I think the connection just dropped on Mike's end, and he should be rejoining us. There he is.
Mike, can you?
Yeah, I think I'm back. And I'm not sure when I dropped, but so I would say that the legal change can either follow encroachment or lead to encroachment, and there's probably a complex feedback system around it. But encroachment itself is probably not exactly the right word to characterize what's going on.
And to what extent is increased human population locally a major driver of PAD?
We have not seen that in what we have observed. certainly, what we see when we look at so 62% were industrial scale stuff, and so I would say that collection is clearly not local population based, although there might be a couple of exceptions embedded within it. Subsequent, the portion that is local land pressures and land claims, and I'm just going to quickly refer to my cheat sheet here, and actually it looks like I can still go back on the slide, so I'll do that. So if you look at the wedge here, okay, so here, if we look at the wedge, so we see subsistence, we see rural settlements, we see land claims. So land claims are really largely associated with redress to historic injustice. So lands that were once owned by people, and then the government said, no, actually this should be protected area, and that rights of due process were not followed in establishing the protected area in the first place. That's that first land claims piece. The subsistence component, that is principally associated with two systemic decisions, one within the United States allowing subsistence use by Native Americans within national parks, so long as it did not negatively affect the ecology. That, I think, was a 2016 decision. The other major piece there was associated with bamboo harvesting in India, again, for subsistence use. Again, I would say neither of those are related to local population growth. The only piece in this which could be local population growth is the rural settlements one. And again, there, I think it's more people moving around and moving to frontiers rather than sort of localized population growth. Again, there are probably exceptions, but I think it's not the key factor.
Great answer. Another question. So clearly, legal and legislative protections aren't enough or aren't always the best option for protecting lands. So what would you say is the best option moving forward? Is there a best case scenario? And how do we shift people's outlook to preserve lands in perpetuity?
Simple
question.
So I guess, yeah, good question. So, I mean, I guess the point of this work the point of this work is to illustrate the potential for laws to be changed, and to underscore the fact that if we want stuff to be conserved in perpetuity, it's not just enough to get it on paper as established, but in fact, we have a collective responsibility to steward these areas and ensure investment in them over the longer term. And that the challenges or the interests over specific places don't go away when the law is first signed or the proclamation is first noted or the judge first renders a decision. And a great example of that is the recurring conversation over the fate of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the US, where I think since the refuge was first established in the 1970s, there have been more than 100 proposals to open it up for oil drilling. And in fact, I think it was in 2017, a decision was actually finally made to allow that to occur by the US Congress. And so I would say that is the key, that's the key message. I think what is interesting to understand and to explore is whether there are other conservation strategies that are as durable or more durable than these state-designated, state-managed protected areas, whether they are private sector investments or private property, or whether it's things like indigenous lands or whatever they may be. There's been a bunch of work increasingly looking at the relative efficacy of these different strategies and underscoring the potential for indigenous lands to maintain forest cover and carbon as well or better than state-designated, state-managed parks and protected areas. The question that logically follows is, well, are they as durable or are they more durable than these other legal regimes like protected areas? And I think that's a research frontier for us to figure out, which then has immediate policy implications as we think about how to sustain nature in perpetuity to deliver all of the benefits to biodiversity and people that it can.
Great. A few more questions. Keep submitting your questions, please. So next question, are governments reflecting the changes to protected areas size in relation to their Aichi targets for CBD, or are they counting original sizes?
So I don't know is the answer. What I can say is that if you look at the World Database of Protected Areas, which is the authoritative repository for information on what is protected and what is not, they only use current data. There's no, it is sort of a constantly updated characterization of coverage of the planet. So there's what is obscured, and the reason that we launched Pad Tracker is the history of what used to be protected, where and when, and that you can then use to understand shifts or evolution in protected area networks. So one hypothesis would be, for example, that the sort of high and far bias that we see in the locations of protected areas globally is partly a reflection of increasing pad within low and near protected areas. And that some of the work that we had done that highlights proximity and performance as factors associated with pad would be consistent with that hypothesis that what the protected area estate used to look like is evolving as human activities are shift in space and time.
Great. And a question about the Pad Tracker itself. Is it global in terms of coverage, or are there any spots that are missing?
So Pad Tracker is a global database and a global map. But as I said, we've only done systematic archival work in 13 countries, which we can sort of highlight. Let's see. Yeah, so we've done in these dark gray. This is where we've done the systematic archival work. So Australia, DRC, Amazonia, and the US, Malaysia as well. The remaining countries has been more opportunistic. We are sort of currently having some conversations to try to get on Russia. Another group of researchers just finished a look at China, which is fantastic. So ideally, we'll have a much more comprehensive picture of the of East Asia and Russia in the near future. Obviously, Canada, we've had some conversations and some opportunistic data, but it represents a major gap. And clearly, all the other stuff in light gray sort of represents opportunities. And so, certainly some places are a little bit trickier to work in terms of ready access to data, but I would think the Southern Cone, Mexico, Canada, Europe would all be, Japan would all be, pretty easy places to make some progress with the right the right team in place. And Pad Tracker is designed to capture that information and share it out with the broader community of people who are interested in understanding the fate of protected areas globally.
And continuing on questions about the Pad Tracker, does it contain or plan to incorporate in the future spatial data on protected areas, current and historic, before the Pad event boundaries or limits?
Good question. So we rely heavily we work with UNEP WCMC and the Protected Planet database for the sort of current extent of protected areas. And then I think in many respects, the Pad Tracker data sort of represents the historic picture when you sort of piece the two of them together. So we certainly have some of that. The interesting thing that you can start to do is do animations over time, where you understand when you know an establishment date and an abandonment date, a pad date, then you can sort of see the ebb and flow of protected lands and waters over time. The only trick with that is that WDPA does not record establishment date. They track the date at which the current configuration began. And so there's often a disconnect between what the protected area looks like now and that sort of maybe prior iterations of it. So what we've been doing for the US and the other places, Amazonia, other places where we've done archival work, is to try to reconstruct that broader baseline of the first establishment date, not the date that corresponds to the current iteration. And then that allows us to better reflect the sort of more dynamic picture that's at play. I believe those data are on Pad Tracker right now for the places where we've done the archival work, but I can't quite remember. If folks are interested, they can reach out and we can probably share that.
Great. And looking at the map, someone has asked, does your work reflect marine protected areas as well? And it looks like it does, but could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Sure. So I started out doing marine stuff. It still has still have a soft spot in my heart for it. We have some marine data, particularly from Australia and a few other places, but we have not yet done the comprehensive inquiry to build that out. So again, that's another frontier. I would say that I suspect that rates of pad in marine protected areas are more modest, partly because most MPAs are quite recent, and so and they're relatively few in number compared to terrestrial protected areas. So the sample size to draw on is more modest. There's also some interesting questions that emerge in terms of intensity of use and competition for access to resources. I think in a lot of the settings that we see where PAD emerges, it's associated with resource scarcity or sort of increasing questions about who can access or should access natural resources, and it may be that there's a little bit less of a competition over ocean resources, or that the starting point for a lot of the marine protected areas already allows for use, whereas the starting point for a lot of terrestrial protected areas is a more strict regime with less use allowed. And so that starting point also has important implications in terms of rates of PAD. Bolivia, for example, often allows a lot of human uses within protected areas, and so there's probably less drive for PAD to subsequently allow activities, where some other countries that started with a sort of the figurative fortress model of fairly strict restrictions on human activities. Subsequently, there's sort of more space for legal changes that would show up in our database as PAD.
And has anyone analyzed if there were equivalent or better options for the development that drove the PAD action in the first place?
No, at least not in a large sample kind of way. There have been a few case studies of where people look carefully at PAD, but not very many. And so again, I think this is a great research frontier for somebody who wants to dig in and think about these questions of governance and land use and conservation. One effort that has gone on, which was high profile a few years ago, was a debate about a road in the Serengeti. And there was a proposal to run a road through, I believe it was Serengeti National Park, and that there was a sort of outcry among advocates and scientists, and one of the things that they did was look at alternate routes for infrastructure, and they suggested that alternate routes would, I believe, be as effective as the one originally proposed.
Interesting. And we'll take a few more questions. But next question: has there been any work looking at the details of the legal mechanisms that allow PAD to happen and potential intervention points for communities at the local level to prevent it?
I think the short answer is no, or not. That has sort of made its way to the sort of mainstream global conversation on this topic. Civil society around the world often really rallies around or reacts strongly to proposed PAD events, and so that is a really interesting phenomenon. And I'm sure that the organizations involved in those processes are very carefully looking at the legal options and mechanisms that they have at play. A lot of this winds up in the courts in the U.S. and elsewhere around the world. And then there's certainly there's also a group of scholars, particularly European scholars, who are thinking about the question of non-regression. So this idea that once an environmental law or policy is put in place, it can ratchet up to be more strict and more protective, but it can't be ratcheted down to be more permissive or less restrictive. I don't know to what extent governments have adopted that principle. It's an interesting argument. There are also those who say that kind of an approach would make doing any kind of progress more challenging, because it sort of locks governments and decision makers in without giving them an outlet for rethinking or down the road. But again, I think that's certainly for legal scholars and policy advocates. Better understanding the policy process and context is an important one. Just to underscore a point I had made in my presentation, one of the things that we see is that because PAD is a blind spot for because PAD is a blind spot for many governments and societies, for many nations, there is not a system governing these decisions that's comparable to establishing protected areas first, for governments to ensure the sort of parallel structure that the policies and systems for making changes to national parks and protected areas should parallel those required for establishing them in the first place.
That's a great answer that leads to our final question from someone, one of our attendees from Bolivia says, how can we as biologists help the government understand that protected areas are very important to biodiversity? And in Bolivia, protected areas are being intervened. Oh, Mike? There you are.
He's back.
Okay. Could you hear the whole question? Mike?
All right, the final question. No,
I think that Mike's lost his bandwidth there. One more shot.
Maybe try without the video and see if that helps.
Just shut off our video.
Yeah, I'll shut off our video.
Okay, and the final question is, I have not heard it yet.
Okay, great. We just turned off our video just to see if that would help. So leading into the answer you just gave, how can biologists help the government understand that protected areas are important for biodiversity? This person is from Bolivia and has examples of protected areas there being intervened in.
Yeah. So I mean, great question. It will vary from context to context to what governments care about and what ministries care about. Different ministries will have different interests. I mean, certainly. The classic thing that the conservation community has done forever is, the spatial overlays between where the biodiversity is and where the protected areas are, and underscoring the point that a lot of what is protected is, or a lot of the biodiversity is within protected areas, and that protection is a key strategy. Protected areas are a key strategy, although one of many strategies for conserving biodiversity. A lot of what my organization, Conservation International, thinks about is how nature can contribute to human well-being, whether it's maintaining ecosystems that are critical sources, sinks for carbon, or hold critical stocks of carbon, whether it's provision of clean water, or pollinator does for humanity, both locally and globally. And one of the things that we've been thinking about more generally is trying to connect our work sort of beyond just the classic questions of environment, but to these other aspects of life, and whether it's questions of health and clean water, whether it's questions of climate and either mitigation of climate change or helping with adaptation in the face of climate change, et cetera. So I think there's sort of this multi-pronged sort of effort, and recognizing that different audiences will care about different things, and that protected areas are sort of only one tool in the toolbox for conservation, although obviously a critical one that we need to invest in to ensure that it reaches its fullest potential.
Great. And thank you so much, Mike, for your presentation today. We learned quite a bit from you, so that was fantastic. And for everyone that's still on, reminder, this was recorded, so we will be sending out a link to you next week with the recording. And we will not have a webinar next month because we will all be in Kuala Lumpur for the International Congress for Conservation Biology. We hope to see a bunch of you there. So stay tuned for August when we will have our next webinar. Thank you from all of us here at SCB.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Have a good day or night.
Thanks.
Bye.